So I'll say good afternoon to everyone.
Good afternoon.
Hope that you're managing. We're going to continue with this analysis and of talking through the historical process now of what we were calling how, what, when, where, why, or whatever order those interrogatives were listed, and we kind of morphed after life cycle and prayer and holiday cycle and the calendar and all that. We've morphed into the historical timeline of what's generally called halakha, of the process of Jewish law, starting with Torah and understanding Torah and the commentaries, the major commentaries to Torah, and then into the Mishnah, the systematic ordering of the mitzvot, then the Gemara that comes and tries to complete, as it were, complete the Mishnah discussion, and that when those two are taken together, that becomes Talmud, and then the parallel literature that takes us into the 300s, 400s of the Common Era is Midrash, the Midrashic literature, which is commentary, but also from the legend and lore perspective. What I'm categorizing it or suggesting to you is that the Midrash, rather than the Talmudic process, is more for teaching. I think I described it more as like this is the syllabus, this is the curriculum of how to understand Torah, rather than understanding the specifics of Jewish law. And we talked about Midrash and the different types of Midrash and some examples. I'm going to come back today to the strict interpretation of Jewish law, of halakha, in the pattern that we refer to as the codes or rabbinic codes. And I'll explain what will happen the next 2 weeks. And then that will bring this whole class idea to a close. And then we'll see where we're going to go from there into the fall. So let's do it this way. As of the Middle Ages, and I don't know how we want to define Middle Ages. I'll leave that up to the historians and their scholarship. But for us to understand Middle Ages beginning as of maybe the 600s and continuing for about 600, 700 years. So let's just arbitrarily say those numbers. So Talmud is certainly the authority of Jewish law. And anyone who, on one hand, anyone who wanted to claim authenticity as a rabbi, as a teacher, as a scholar, as a judge, would have to be knowledgeable in Talmud. On the other hand, there was a recognition that Talmud had a, let's call it a foible, in the sense that frequently, and I see this personally, I see this as a positive, but frequently Talmud, the Talmudic literature and the way that it was processed and then handed down would include all kinds of extraneous material, would include references that most people were not really cognizant of or able to parse them out and understand exactly what it means. Talmud was filled with contradictions and paradoxes. It's a very rich collection of material, obviously, but as we've said, it has both the majority opinion, the minority opinion. Hillel said this, Shammai said this, Rabbi Meir says this, Rabbi Yehuda says this. And while there usually, almost always, is a concluding point to to the debate or the discussion, but it gives validity, and I find this as a positive, but it gives validity to all the different nuances or the different ways that a particular question or interpretation might be found. As the community continued, once the process of Talmud stops in the 600s, 700s, as we enter into the Middle Ages, then all of the different commentaries, and I explained to you how there's the Rashi commentary, and then there's the Tosafos commentary, and there's the Maimonides commentary, and all of these that are included on a page of Talmud, and the cross references and the concordances that give you the biblical quote and all that. Once that process was somewhat finalized, then the community, and by the community, I don't mean the rabbis. I mean like you folks, I should say, us folks, weans, that Amcha, the people of Israel, realized that Talmud was no longer the major source. It was still a source for scholarship, but it was no longer the major source for their daily lives, if you will, dealing with all the things that they had to deal with in their daily lives, whether that's on the one hand, whether that's poverty and persecution, or whether that's simcha and joy and celebration and observance. They found basically what the historians and the scholars tell us is that the people in the Jewish communities were finding that they had two basic problems with Talmud, or at least Talmud as it had been handed down to them. Again, most of them didn't have it on their library shelves, but as they understood the Talmud and its process, they had two problems. One was finding some kind of ultimate answer or resolution to their question or their problem in this vast collection of disputes and arguments. Do I really need to know all of these Baba Mises and all of this, like I said, extraneous material that Rabbi Meir or Rabbi Yehuda, Elazar, or whomever it was, included in their statement? Why couldn't it just say, and Rabbi Elazar taught X, Y, and Z, X, Y, and Z, whatever it might be. So on the one hand, the people, Amcha, felt frustrated that it was awkward, if not nigh impossible, for the average person to find answers to their questions unless they were very familiar with all of the material, and unless they were in a community that had a knowledgeable rabbi or sage or someone who knew exactly how to interpret the literature. The second problem that we are told was the communities. Now, once we had Jewish communities in what will become Germany and Hungary and Poland and those areas, that how to understand the text that was handed down to them as Talmud, but now seemed almost not necessarily irrelevant, but it was certainly alien to their own surroundings and their own situations. The period of the Talmud and those who wrote in it and those who are quoted in it, their life was totally different than the lives of the Jews who were now living in what we refer to as Europe or North Africa, whatever it might be. And their lifestyle, their issues, their concerns, their climate, their agriculture, everything was now different, alien from the surroundings of the rabbis and the characters who taught and are quoted in the Talmud. So as a result of those two main factors, and there are certainly others, but as a result of those, in the next period of time of approximately 1,000 years, the legal literature is generally referred to as the period of the rabbinic codes, C-O-D-E-S, the collection of codes. And the codes took three forms. The least familiar to us, for the most part, as legal literature, the least familiar is what is called, and some of you might connect into the Hebrew word, chidushim. Now, some of you might know the Hebrew word chadash, which means new. It comes from the same word chodesh, which is the month, sometimes even referred to as the moon. Rosh Chodesh is the new month, that when we have the new moon, if you will. But the Chidushim represented a body of literature of rabbis and teachers and storytellers who would try to make relevant Talmudic, especially stories, the legends and the lore, the Midrash Agadah that I've been talking about. They would try to make these ancient stories relevant to the people in their new communities by adding a chidush, adding something that was new. Today we would say making it more relevant, making it more contemporary, making it more immediate, giving illustrations, giving examples from the particular lifestyle and environment and atmosphere in which the people found themselves, as opposed to the stories of what took place in Jerusalem or in Yavna or in Alexandria or wherever the Talmudic issue might have occurred. The best example, and some of you that I've been with in various circumstances, I can give you a very modern, my own interpretation, not my own example of a chidush, and this is the following. And I apologize to those who have heard it at least once before, if not several times before. A chidush is when someone gives you an entirely new way of looking at a question, at a quote, at a story, whatever it might be. I guess the psychologists would call it the aha moment. Oh, now I understand what that might have been. So years and years and years ago, I was with a group, I think that they were third or fourth graders in a Sunday school context. And we were talking about, it was right before Pesach, right before Passover, and we were telling the story of Moses, who had, if you remember, he had smote an Egyptian taskmaster, and he ran away and took refuge with Jethro, who becomes his father-in-law. And then there's the burning bush experience, and Moses, of course, in the story, the way that we tell it to the little kids, is that Moses goes up onto the mountain to try to retrieve a little lamb that had gone away from the rest of the, or sheep or whatever. And God's voice comes to Moses out of the burning bush and says, Moses, I want you to go and talk to Pharaoh and tell him, let my people go. And if you remember, Moses's response is, who, me? I can't go to Pharaoh. I am slow of speech is the actual phrase. I'm slow of speech. And most commentators throughout the centuries have understood that as Moses saying that either he was a stutterer or he had some kind of a speech impediment and whatever. So I remember years ago telling this story and using that phrase that Moses was slow of speech, and there was a little girl sitting in the front row, and all the kids are sitting on the floor, or around me, and she raises, "Rabbi, Rabbi, Rabbi, Rabbi." Yeah, yes, what is? I know why Moses was slow of speech. Okay, why was he slow of speech? Because he forgot how to speak in Egyptian. Okay. He left, he grew up in Egypt, gone to school in Egypt, whatever, but he had left Egypt and been gone for a good number of years. And God says to Moses, "Go and speak to Pharaoh." And he's saying, "What, me? If I speak to the most important, most powerful ruler in the world, how would I be able to do that? I don't even remember how to say hello in Egyptian," kind of thing. And so what she said was a chidush. It was making that, in this case, it was a particular story, but it was an insight into why Moses had said these particular words. Now, use that same method in talking about a Talmudic discussion or dispute, or a particular statement of, this is the halacha, this is what you should do. And adding a layer of resonance and relevance to a particular dispute, discussion, whatever. So that's one of the three types of literature that develop after the formalized Talmudic literature exists. There are some rabbis and students who will then try to explain or make more relevant a particular issue, dispute, argument, quotation, decision from them by using a story, using a new chidush. Okay, so the chidushim are one, and if you would to look into the literature, which I did in the last couple of days, just in preparation for what I was going to say today, they translate a chidush as far as this official body of literature. They translate it as a novella. So they're like short collection of short stories rather than specific description of the law or of the practice or of the custom or whatever. So that's one of the three that I wanted to mention. The second is one with which we are more familiar, and I'm just going to touch on it a little bit today. But then for the next 2 weeks, this is what we will be focusing on. So the second body of literature that develops under the broad rubric of codes is what we call responsa. In Hebrew, teshuvot, answers to specific questions. Every generation, every country, if not every community, they either had in most cases, a rabbi, although it didn't really have to be someone who was ordained as a rabbi, and someone who carried the title of rabbi as master teacher. But every country or every generation could identify 1, 2, 3 of these rabbis, of these sages, who were I can't use a phrase like chief rabbi because we didn't have that kind of hierarchy, but they had the reputation, they had developed the knowledge, the eloquence, and people responded to them and to their interpretations as officially. This is what Rabbi so-and-so said, and therefore this is what we should do. If we don't know the answer, we're going to ask. Now, this is long before sending a text, long before, you know, Google or any other kind of email opportunity. And so it might take certainly weeks, if not months, if not even years, to get an answer to our question. But this was the process. The rabbis who had that kind of reputation and were known at least by word of mouth or by traveling rabbis, itinerant preachers. There's a tradition that's called the Magid. We know that word again from the Haggadah, and I mentioned it when we were introducing Midrash also. The Magid was kind of like an itinerant preacher who would go, and he would be using especially more of these chidushim that I was just referring to, rather than saying, okay, this is an official halachic interpretation and statement. But a teshuvah or response to a particular question would be addressed to usually a rabbi who had one of two titles. And they're informal, unofficial titles, and they weren't granted by any official body. Like I say, there's no hierarchy. And it's not that you had to have served X number of years as a rabbi or as a judge. And it's not that you were elected to this position. It's not that you were named to this position by any one other rabbi or group of rabbis or whatever. It's just by reputation, by experience, these individual rabbis, wherever they might have been, were known with the title of either Gaon, and you might have heard of that one, G-A-O-N. Some of the very famous rabbis who are involved in writing the prayer book, for example. We talked about Sadia Gaon. A Gaon is literally a master, someone who, it comes from the word that means to be proud. So it's someone who is proud of his ability to respond to the questions that might be coming along. The other has a little more of a mystical connotation to it. The other was an Ilui, and Ilui comes from one of the words that it means more like brilliant. And the more about the Ilui than the Gaon, there are these the stories of someone who could usually with a photographic memory, or if you stuck a pin in through a volume of Talmud or whatever, and the Ilui would be able to tell you every word on every page that was being poked through by that pin. It's a remarkable kind of, and it probably didn't really happen, but it was a way of describing the brilliance and the illumination of some of these minds. So there were these distinguished, recognized authorities who may have been thousands of miles away from our particular community. And yet, by virtue of either their reputation or by virtue of someone whom they knew who had some kind of interaction with that rabbi before, or the name and the address was given by one of these magids, by one of these itinerant preachers who had been coming around. And so they felt comfortable by saying, okay, we don't know the answer to this question. It's perplexing us. We're going to send a letter by messenger to this individual. Now, somebody, I didn't see who it was, but someone just sent me a little chat question about the Sephardic title Chacham. Chacham is a wise one, but it's a little bit later in the literature, and it's specifically an honorary title from the Sephardic community. But it probably meant the same thing, or came from the same background. You didn't. You didn't. It's not like you. If you study for 6 years and successfully pass the exams, that you're given the title of Chacham. It was an honorific in that sense. So the best example, simple example that I could give you about the responsa literature, and again, next week and the week after, I want to talk and give you lots of examples, and maybe even we can take off the mutes and we can, in a sense, write our own response to a question that might perplex us, whether it has to do with the face masks or something with COVID or whatever. But the best example of a responsum that comes from the Middle Ages is the following. And again, I apologize to some of you who may have heard me paraphrase this in one context or another. Is a letter is written from the Jews of, and I will defer to anybody who's more of a world traveler than I am, of the Elephantine Island. Now, Elephantine Island, I believe, is off the coast of Egypt. I'm not sure if it's in the Mediterranean or in the like in the Nile Delta. And if somebody knows, let us know officially. But the Jews of Elephantine were isolated. Obviously, they weren't going to have any kind of a very knowledgeable rabbi in their community, small community, but they had a question. Someone realized that, and note the way that I explain this, someone realized that he, and we're only talking about the men here, that he had accidentally, unintentionally prayed his morning prayers, okay, with his head covered. And the question, no one doubted, the question was not about his intention in prayer. The question was, did having his head covered, did that render his prayers unkosher, so to speak, or impure? In other words, parenthetically, we read into that the Jews, at least of Elephantine Island, the Jews did not cover their heads ordinarily when they said their prayers. Okay, David had put up a hand, and Ruth Ann.
Yes, thank you. Elephantine Island is an island in the Nile, and it's part of the city of Aswan, and there are archaeological sites there.
Near Aswan. Okay, yeah. Great, thank you.
That's the same
Ruth Ann,
one.
were you doing the same thing?
Same thing. They had a Jewish community until about the 4th century of the Common Era.
Got it. Okay, thank you. Although I think the community lasted later. This particular responsa, now maybe there were Jews who went back there later on, but this particular responsa is from much later than the 4th century. But okay, so they send a letter to one of these Gaon, one of these well-known and acknowledged rabbinic leaders, and it took I don't know, years for an answer to get back to them that basically said, don't worry, it's okay if you have your head covered when you say your prayers. As a matter of fact, in our community, this Gaon writes, most men, not all, and not that you must, most men do cover their heads, especially if they are on their way, after the synagogue or after their prayers, if they're on their way to work, which was undoubtedly an outdoor activity, and they kept their heads covered. So what we learned from this is that there were communities, maybe Elephantine was isolated and they hadn't been involved in a quote unquote halachic change, or again, pardon the use of the word, in a reform of the tradition. But at least in the Elephantine Island, they prayed without their heads being covered, and that was their norm. So they couldn't find an answer in the literature that was available to them. The rabbi or the leader of the community was not comfortable in making a particular decision, so they wrote a letter. It took a long time, but they did get an answer. And in the archives, we have copies of that literature. So we'll talk much more about those, especially talking about some biomedical ethic issues and as well as cultural and religious issues. There's some very meaningful literature in the responsa type of more modern literature that comes out of the Holocaust period, that rabbis, including some of the most famous rabbis in Europe, who were in the concentration camps, and they were still asked questions by believing devout Jews. And what should I do, Rabbi? So I'll share some of that material with you as well over the next 2 weeks. But the type of the code that I wanted to focus on for the most part is, again, categorized or generalized as the comprehensive codes of Jewish law, to kind of update the Talmud, not so much the material of the Talmud, but the organization of the Talmud, to update it, systematize it, and respond to the needs of Amcha, of the people, as well as the smaller communities that might not have access to the most knowledgeable and articulate of rabbis or teachers. So to remind you that if you're sitting in Minsk or Pinsk or wherever it might be, or Elephantini, I don't know, and you had a question about Shabbat, you would start by going to the Talmud. One of the tractates of the Talmud is called Shabbat. And you would assume then that you could look through that volume and you could find the answer of what you're looking for. But not necessarily, because on the one hand, there's all kinds of extraneous material. And on the other hand, there's all kinds of, well, let's divert your attention to the discussion that takes place in some other tractate, in some other book. It might not have an immediate relevance for you for Shabbat, but you'll get the understanding once you've done this, once you've done it. And if it's Shabbat, or if it's Passover, you start with the tractate of Pesachim, or if it's about Yom Kippur, you start with the tractate of Yoma. But you would easily and quickly be diverted to other sources and other tractates. And contrary to those of us who are sitting around these days with very little to do, these people very quickly were pulled away to other issues or opportunities or interference and whatever. And they didn't have the patience to go through all of that. I just want an answer to my question. I just need to know how I should define sunset, or I just need to know, when does Shabbat start, when does Shabbat end. I just need to know, how to do this or how to do that. So the first set of codes, as it were, literally were summaries. Okay, let's try to summarize all of the laws and all of the customs and all of the beliefs about Shabbat. We don't need all of the legends and the lore. We don't need to have a discussion, as we did last week or the week before. We don't need to have a discussion in here about what does it mean when God said, let us create man in our image. That's immaterial for my question right now of when does Shabbat start? How many candles am I supposed to light? When on Pesach, on Passover, if it says you shall eat, the mitzvah is you shall eat matzah for 7 days. Okay, how much matzah do I have? Is that a whole box? You know, how much do I have to eat each day? I want to fulfill the mitzvah. How much is that? I don't need to go back into the story again of how much, you know, how much dough each Israelite put on their backpack when they left Egypt. I don't need all that. I just need to know how much matzah I'm supposed to eat to fulfill the mitzvah. Those are examples. So they wanted they wanted the specific answers to their relating to belief, relating to practice, relating to ritual, relating to understand the mitzvot, things like that. So the first of these collections is attributed actually to a rabbi who's known in, it's an easy name for us to remember, or anybody who has a musical orientation. It's a good, you can remember the fellow's name is Riff, R-I-F, okay? The Riff, Rabbi Isaac of Fez. Now, Fez is Morocco, but actually he's Algerian, and they date him 1013 to 1103. Rabbi Isaac of Fez, his last name was Alfasi. Sephardic, as many of these rabbis who wrote the codes will be Sephardic. Sephardim actually were the more authoritative, more aristocratic segment of the community, rather than the Ashkenazim, who were up north in what will become Europe. Most of them were peasants, whereas more of the aristocracy and those who were active in government and medicine and things like that were the Sephardic community. So Isaac of Fez, Isaac Alfasi, the Rif, compiled his codes, or his code that was called Sefer HaHalachot, the book of Jewish laws, if you will. And that starts the process, the process going. It's the first one that we have references where people quote, as the Rif said in his book, Sefer Halachot. There probably were other rabbis who started to do their own collections. Like, for example, when we were talking 1,000 years previously, that there were other rabbis before Judah the Prince who were compiling versions of the Mishnah. But Isaac of Fez, Isaac Alfasi's code is really the first one that people start to refer to as a recognized code. Then the next one, it was written by, and it's a huge body of material, was written by someone whose name I'm sure is familiar to everyone, at least who's on this call, and that's Maimonides, the Rambam, Moses ben Maimon, Moses the son of Maimon, known as Maimonides, dated 1135 to 1204. Now, we'll be talking about Maimonides and the Rambam a lot, I'm sure, in lots of opportunities that we have to be together, to study together. Certainly the Torah study people are familiar with Rambam's commentary, as famous as Rashi is. One of the differences is that Maimonides, who of course is brilliant, and he's not only a rabbi, but he's also a physician and very, very knowledgeable. What he writes is in Arabic, incidentally, and has commentaries to every major collection of Jewish literature at that as of that date. Torah, Talmud, Midrash commented on everything. The man didn't have any ego whatsoever, obviously. But he also, today we would say he had a PhD in rational philosophy. In addition to his Judaic knowledge, in addition to his medical knowledge, he was also a philosopher, a student of philosophy. He loved Aristotle. And for those of you who may be more knowledgeable than I, or if you have some kind of a background or have studied philosophy, there's a lot of rational thinking that permeates through Maimonides' writing. Just as an aside, most people are familiar with another one of Maimonides' books that was entitled in Hebrew, the Moreh Nevuchim, or the Guide for the Perplexed, or Guide to the Perplexed. Simply put, those who were perplexed are those who were having difficulty finding a balance between rational thought and or science, if you will, on the one hand, and religious faith on the other hand. Between science and faith. If you're perplexed by this, here's my guide on how you can explain and understand without compromising either one of those two approaches to life and approaches to knowledge that you might have. So in our discussion today, Maimonides' magnum opus, if you will, his amazingly large collection is called the Mishneh Torah. Torah is a name that obviously everybody knows. Mishneh, as opposed to the Mishnah that began the Talmudic process, Mishneh would be translated here as a teaching or a re-envisioning, I'm losing my words at this point, but it's a repetition, it's a restatement of Torah, and by Torah he doesn't mean 5 books of Moses. He means all of Jewish law at this point. And the Mishneh Torah begins as a code of Jewish life and Jewish law, begins with a summary of Maimonides' understanding of Aristotle and of metaphysics, and then he moves from that into a foundation of Jewish law. Then he goes through, and I'll talk a little bit more in more detail about what he does, but everything is with this goal of balancing between those things that we do on faith and those things that we do because they make sense. They make sense for us as human beings and as Jews. Now, he began with the Aristotle, and he ends with something that is completely different also. He ends his body of literature, the last section, with details and halakha on how we as Jews, how we are supposed to act in ways that will help bring about, and then when it actually does come about, that the Messiah, the Mashiach, will be arriving. How do we know that the individual who comes and says, I am the Messiah, how do we know that he's real? How do we know that this is really the Messiah? And what will he, I'm sorry to put it as he rather than she, but I'm quoting Maimonides, how do we know what he will be expected to accomplish? And when we realize that indeed this individual is the Messiah, what are we supposed to do? How are we supposed to respond? What changes in our lives? Okay. Simple example, and some of you probably will relate to it either from the standpoint of Holocaust study or some other study in Jewish history, or from the liturgy now in our contemporary prayer books, especially at our Yizkor services and on Yom Kippur. Maimonides' phrase of Ani ma'amin be'emunah shlema, I believe with perfect faith, b'viat HaMashiach, in the coming of the Messiah, v'af al pi sheyitmamea, and even though he tarries, even though he's delayed or chooses to delay himself, af al pi ani ma'amin. Despite all this, I still believe. It's a matter of belief. And so with all of the other experiences, dinim, all of the laws, all of the interpretations, all of the mitzvot, all of the decisions, he tries to give us rational explanation, either that was used when it was first written down, or how we, in our day or in Maimonides' days, how we could respond to those particular questions and still be true to our human thought. But ultimately, there will be those things like the coming of the Messiah, in which we must simply say, Ani ma'amin, I believe. I'm not going to be able to prove it. I'm not going to be able to explain it to anyone. It's simply a matter of emunah. It's simply a matter of faith and belief. Sidebar, a contemporary of Maimonides in the Christian world, in the Catholic world, is a philosopher theologian by the name of Tertullian. And Tertullian answers the same kind of question within the Catholic framework and says, I believe because it is absurd. In other words, I can't explain it. Absurd, not haha, funny, out of the ordinary, but absurd because it defies all logic. And then at that point, and some of us on the Saturday morning, also, much later philosopher talks Kierkegaard. I get to the point where I say it's a leap of faith, is Kierkegaard's thing. It's a leap of faith. I either believe it or I don't believe it. And Maimonides says, as Tertullian says in his world, if I choose to believe it, that leads me to salvation. Maimonides says, if enough of the Jews will choose to believe it, that will hasten bringing the Messiah. So I can't explain why that will be or how that will be, but that's the way that he addresses it near the end of his Mishneh Torah. Okay, so Mishneh Torah, Maimonides' huge book, only cites, and again, as I mentioned, it's in Arabic. He only cites the end results of any of the Talmudic discussions on any particular subject matter. And here's the quote of his goal: to make study of Talmud unnecessary for those who merely want to know the law. Okay? For those who merely want to know the law, you can look in my book. If you want to see the entire scope of the literature, then I refer you over to the Talmud. Okay. So that's Maimonides. Same generation, if you will, is a rabbi in Spain. His family originally came from Germany, and so they had a little bit more of the Ashkenazi background. But he lives in Spain and becomes most famous in Toledo. For those of us from Michigan, it was Toledo, but if it's Toledo, really in Spain. And this is Rabbi Jacob ben Asher. His father and his grandfather were rabbis, were very, very well known in Germany as rabbis and scholars. But Jacob ben Asher writes his code that he calls the 4 pillars or 4 columns. In Hebrew, the Arba'at Turim. A tur, T-U-R, is a pillar or a column on which the entire house is built. And his goal is to place all of the halacha, all of the daily needs of Amcha, of the people, into one of 4 pillars or one of 4 columns of Jewish life. His quote in the introduction, if you will, is, I'm writing this so that the children of Israel, the Bnei Yisrael, can regulate their daily life according to Torah. So that's Jacob ben Asher, who's known as the Baal HaTurim. Baal is a master. Now, again, Torah study people are going to say, wait, Baal, that's the pagan god. Yeah, it's the same word, but here in this sense, it means the master of. So the master of the Turim, Baal HaTurim, is Jacob ben Asher. And so he identifies all of Jewish life, that the average Mr., what I would call the average Mr. and Mrs. Chaim Yankel, the average Mr. and Mrs. Beth Shalom Temple Center member, okay? What the average Jewish person needs to know about Jewish life will be contained in this collection of the 4 pillars. 4 pillars are the Orach Chaim is like the path of life, including the prayers, how to observe Shabbat, how to observe the different holidays, things like that. The second one is Yoreh Deah. That's mostly the kosher laws, how to maintain dietary laws, and questions of charity, and what you're supposed to do when you're in mourning, if there's been a death in the family. Pillar number 3 is Even HaEzer, the stone or the rock, the helping rock, literally. Even HaEzer is all the daily laws that we need to know about marriage, about divorce, about family, things like that. And then the 4th is Choshen Mishpat. The Choshen, if you remember, again, Torah study people, the Choshen was the breastplate that the high priest would wear. And so he called it the Choshen Mishpat, the breastplate of justice, all questions of civil law and civil and criminal law within the Jewish context. So those were his 4 columns or 4 pillars, the Arba'at Turim, and that was the third famous one. If we go with the Rif, Alfasi is the first, Sefer Halachot, then Mishneh Torah of Maimonides, then the Baal HaTurim, and then we come to the 4th, which is historically the most influential, the most well-known, even more than Maimonides. Maimonides is known for lots of things, but more influential than Maimonides' code is the Shulchan Aruch, the prepared table, the set table, if you will. The editor, and there's a story that goes along with this, the editor is a Sephardic rabbi, somewhat of a disciple or contemporary of the mystics, the Kabbalists in Tzfat, in Safed, in northern Israel, northern Palestine at the time. Joseph Cairo, he goes on later on to invent like some kind of maple syrup, I think, something like that, but whatever. Joseph Cairo, 1488 to 1575. Actually, the Shulchan Aruch, like I said, that's what he calls it, it's intentionally, the image is that so the children of Israel the Bnei Yisrael, or Amchal, as I'm saying, the people can come into Jewish life and have it prepared for them. Here's the table. Everything is set. Everything is laid out for you right here. Just come and enjoy. Sit down, eat, say your bracha, say your blessing, be satisfied, and everything is right here for you, according to the Sephardic interpretation, which was the more important and the more influential at the time. Actually, the Shulchan Aruch, Cairo, what he did is kind of a rewriting of his commentary on Maimonides' Mishnah Torah, and he condenses it. And his publisher or whatever came along and said, "Hey Joe, I got an idea for you. Why don't you take all of your commentary and take this structure that this guy over in Toledo used, take the four pillars, take that and put all of your commentary, because people love your work, Joe, and put your commentary into a 4-volume or 4-chapter kind of work. And when we'll consolidate it, we'll shorten it a little bit." So he takes his commentary on Maimonides' Mishnah Torah and on some other different lesser known codes. And in his introduction, there are 2 things that I wish to point out. One is, and again, the fellow had no ego whatsoever. It was typical of the rabbis of those days, right? Okay. He says in his introduction 2 things that I would point out. One is the purpose of this book of Shulchan Aruch is to give a single statement. I can't read my own writing. A simple statement of the Jewish law as it affects the life of the ordinary Jew. Okay, so I want to simplify it. I want to make it available to Jewish law can be effective for the ordinary Jew. But the second part I find extremely insightful is that his phrasing in the statement that I just mentioned is not only here is the simple statement of the law as it affects the life of the ordinary Jew. It's not Jew, period. It's ordinary Jew, comma, man or woman. Actually, I forget if it's husband or wife or man or woman. In other words, Cairo is recognizing at that point already in the 1500s that Jewish women could read. That Jewish women were literate. Not every single one, obviously. Not every single male was literate. But that there were, and he acknowledges that the women have an important role to play in the religious life of their community and in each particular Jewish home. I find that a very, very important statement already in the 1500s. Okay, one of the people that I study with, who teaches at Jewish Theological Seminary, Barry Holtz, and I jokingly mentioned his name to you, that his real call of fame is not because of the teaching that he does, not because of the the books that he writes or the articles, but because he's married to my rabbi's daughter. So that's his real claim to fame. But Barry Holtz wrote about Shulchan Aruch the following way: those who wished to enter the banquet hall of Torah could find its contents laid out in elegant simplicity. Okay, so they were using this image of, here's the set table, here's the prepared table, here's the Shulchan Aruch. It's all set for us and ready for us to go. Cairo ignored all areas of the halacha that were no longer applicable. So you're not going to find stuff about the sacrifices. You're not going to find stuff about the Kohen Gadol, about the high priest. That's not in the Shulchan Aruch. Also, he arbitrarily decided which things he would just reject and just leave out. Now, maybe there was an editor saying, Joe, it's too long. You got to cut a couple pages. I don't know. But there are definitely things that are left out that he arbitrarily just chooses to leave out. Now, this is the majority community, the majority active practicing community is, as I mentioned, is a Sephardic community. This is after 1492. This is after the expulsion from Spain and Portugal, from the Iberian Peninsula. So the Jewish community to which Cairo is addressing his book and his work is primarily in Palestine, in Turkey, in Greece, some in Italy, some in what will become Bulgaria, that area, if you will. But the Shulchan Aruch gains universal, or to the extent that there's universal throughout the Jewish world, acceptance, not so much because of Cairo's influence himself, as through the ingenuity. This guy may have had a creative editor also and publisher, I don't know, but through the ingenuity of a Polish rabbi whose name is Isserles, Rabbi Moses or Moshe Isserles, Isserles. Isserles, same contemporary of Cairo, whether they actually met or not, no one seems to know. Isserles died, we're not sure the year of his birth, but he dies in 1572. He's Polish, but he's actually buried in Prague. And those of you who may have visited the Jewish cemetery, it's an amazing visit in Prague. Okay? They will show you a number of different important graves. One of them being Moses Isserles. Okay? And talk about rabbinic ego. Moses Isserles wrote the epitaph that should be on his headstone, which was a quotation, a jarbled quotation, if you will, or a reinterpreted translation that basically says, Mi Moshe ad Moshe lo kam b'Yisrael navi kehu, or kamonu. Okay? From Moses to Moses. Now, is that Moses, Moshe Rabbeinu in the Torah? To Moses meaning me? There never has arisen anyone as great of a prophet and teacher, in all of Israel. Is that from Moses of the Torah all the way to me, or is it from Moses Maimonides? So a little, only a couple hundred years from Moses Maimonides to we really don't know. But it's a cute insight into their, as I'm mentioning, into their egos and their attempts at recognition and reputation. So Moses Isserles writes simply, or I'm oversimplifying, writes the Ashkenazi response to the Sephardic code of law that Cairo had written. Okay, obviously there are differences in the communities between the European experience and the North African experience or the Palestinian experiences. There are some things that they did similarly. There are some things that they couldn't do similarly. Simple example, okay? In the Sephardic community, you must have a wedding, a Jewish wedding must take place outdoors. End of matter. Must take place outdoors. Okay, why? Because the blessing to Abraham and Sarah was that they should have as many children as the stars of the heaven. How can you talk about stars of the heaven if there's a roof over your heads? Don't get involved with chuppah. That's something else we talked about. Okay, but you should be able to see the stars above you when you get married. Well, again, that may be fine in Sfat, in Jerusalem, in Cairo, or whatever, or Athens, but it wasn't necessarily fine in Minsk or Pinsk or Warsaw or Detroit, Michigan, wherever it might be. So the Ashkenazi community said, well, wait a minute. We understand that the ideal would be to get married under the open stars, but if it comes down to a question of if there's lousy weather or if we can't see the stars, does that mean we postpone the wedding, or do we go ahead with the wedding? And the answer is, if you're looking it up in the Shulchan Aruch and if you're looking it up in the comment, the answer is no. You go ahead with the wedding, obviously. Now the Sephardim may disagree, but that's what the Ashkenazi would do. So Isserles writes his commentary to the Shulchan Aruch, to the prepared table, calls it the tablecloth, the mapah, because you can't really have the prepared table without acknowledging that there needs to be a tablecloth underlying everything that you're going to celebrate with or that you're going to eat with. So we have the mapah and the Shulchan Aruch, the tablecloth and the prepared table, and they're published together since the 1600s. If you have a collection of Shulchan Aruch with the mapah, with the commentary, the Ashkenazi commentary, that you can tell which is which. The Cairo print is in block print, or the Cairo side is in block print, and the Isserles side is in Rashi script. So it's like different fonts, so you can tell which was which. Reflected and respectfully respected both communities, because you needed to know if you were an Ashkenazi community, if you were in a Sephardic community. It's not a matter of tension between the two. It's a matter of affirming which was the most appropriate interpretation for where we are living and how we wish to live. Perhaps because the Shulchan Aruch with the mapah is the first major Jewish work, even before the Torah. It's the first major Jewish work to be printed on the printing press. Okay, and for mass production, that's why it becomes so widely accepted. That's the time frame. So Gutenberg publishes his Bible. I don't know whether or not he was allowed to or permitted to print the Jewish Bible, so to speak, but those printing houses that develop, especially in northern Italy, that develop after Gutenberg, the first Jewish text that was mass-produced, whatever that meant 400 years ago, but mass-produced was the Shulchan Aruch with the mapah. I want to give you two very quick. No, I'll do this one. Do one thing. I'll hold the other one for next week because the time's coming short. We talked about the Shulchan Aruch. We talked about the mapah, the tablecloth, as it were. In the late Middle Ages, when you studied to become a rabbi, you studied Talmud, yes, and you studied Chumash, Torah, and whatever, but you were examined on your knowledge of Shulchan Aruch. Okay, so because Talmud is a never-ending process. So and Shulchan Aruch certainly quotes Talmud, but when you sat to become a rabbi, it's like your PhD oral exams or defend your dissertation. When you sat before a Beit Din, a court of three rabbis, they tested you on your knowledge of Shulchan Aruch rather than on Torah. So Joseph Telushkin, who writes a lot in our day, and includes when in his one-page summary of Shulchan Aruch, he includes this little thing, and with this I will end today. So to this day, this is Telushkin talking. To this day, rabbinic ordination, which is known as smicha, incidentally, it was, I mentioned it on Saturday morning in services. Smicha is descended from the ceremony of Moses placing his hands on Joshua, and that's the first time that we encounter this particular verb to transmit the authority from one generation, one leader to another. So smicha. Rabbinic ordination usually is given to a student only after he is patient. The rabbi's first question was, name the 5 volumes of the Shulchan Aruch. The student, thinking that the rabbi had made a slip of the tongue, named the 4 volumes. And it's the same names as I gave you from Jacob Ben Asher, the four columns, those 4 volumes. But the rabbi said, no. What's the name of the 5th volume? The student said, but there is no 5th volume. The rabbi said, there is indeed. Common sense is the 5th volume. And if you don't have it, all your rulings will be of no use, even if you know the other 4 by heart. So even in the Middle Ages, they were aware that you needed a little bit more than just knowledge of, book learning, so to speak, in order to lead your people, if you will. So like I said, at that point, I have a little bit more to talk about with codes, and then we'll shift back into the responsa literature.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. That was very interesting.
Thanks.